We're on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis on the top line. Omer of Asi, Omer Rabbi Yochanan. Zar shesider es hamarocha chayav. We're talking about a zar, and we learned already back on Daf Chav Daled that there's a chiv misa b'dei shamayim in the case of a zar who usurps the avoda of the Kohen. And Rabbi Yochanan applies this to the case of Sidur Marocha, when they would set up the wood on the Marocha al Gabi Mizbeach, the wood for the fire. And we're not talking about the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, that's going to come later on. And the Gemara now understands that this is called an avoda tama, because what's happening is there's nothing else that has to be done with the wood itself. The eitzim themselves have to be placed on the mizbeach, and that's what he did. So as far as the Kohen is concerned, vis-a-vis the eitzim, he has concluded that avoda. And that gives it the chshivus, and it fulfills the condition that's necessary to generate a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. So that's going to be the case of zar shesider es hamarocha, according to Rabbi Yochanan. Later on, the Gemara is going to offer a variant transmission of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, the Gemara asks the following: Eitzadu oseh. What should we do in the case where, unfortunately, the Zar went ahead and he put the Eitzim al Gabi Mizbeach? And the answer is Parka v'chozer v'sodra. The Zar should take it apart and put it together again. And that doesn't make any sense. Maya Hanile, what do you gain from this? It's just an exercise in futility. I mean, it was the Zar who put the eitzim on the Eish, and now he's taking it off, putting it back on again. We need a Kohen to be Mesader the eitzim al mizbeach. So this doesn't make any sense. Ella, but rather you have to reformulate Rabbi Yochanan. Parka Zar, a Zar could take it apart, but Sodra Kohen. Obviously, we need a Kohen now to do the avoda of Sidur Marocha, Sidur Eitzim al Gabi Marocha. And once the Kohen does this, everything is rectified. The original Sidur Marocha on the part of the Zar has been removed. The Zar himself, on the other hand, is Chayav Misa b'dei shamayim, because he usurped the avoda of the Kohen. Now the question is, would this halacha of avoda that's usurped by the Zar and generates a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, does that apply even to an avodas laila? In general, we could say that the avoda during the day that requires day is more chashuv than the avodas laila. And this is the objection raised here by Rabbi Zera. Maskif le Rabbi Zera, v'chiyesh lecha avoda shekshera b'layla upsula bizar. Now, the literal translation of the words of Rabbi Zera here indicate that when the Torah allows the avoda to take place at night, then even if that avoda was implemented by a Zar, that would be perfectly acceptable. However, many Rishonim understood, the Tosi Yishonim here on the Daf, that the issue here, Reb Zera focuses exclusively on the Chiyuv Misa b'dei shamayim in the case of the Zar who sets up the Eitzim on the Mizbeach. Rabbi Zera never questioned that this was certainly an avoda that requires Kohen, but he felt that we downgrade the status of this avoda relative to other avodas that require Yom because they can be performed balayla. And by downgrading it, it goes down one notch and it doesn't generate a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. The simple pshat here, however, in Rashi seems to indicate that Rabbi Zera is talking in general about whether or not this avodah could be kshera bizarre. And Rabbi Zera thinks that since this avodah can be implemented balayla, therefore the Torah does not absolutely require a Kohen. But be that as it may, Rabbi Zera, in classifying Seder Marocha, Seder Eitzim al Gabe Marocha as an avodas laila, cannot accept Rabbi Yochanan's statement that a zar shesider es hamarocha is chayiv mitzvah. That can't be. And the Gemara says, "V'lo." Wait a second, Rabbi Zera, you're operating with the premise that in order for the zar to be chayiv misa, he's got to have taken on an avoda which could only be kshera b'yom. And that's not so. Gemara objects, v'harei evarim upidarim, the evarim of the zeva have to be placed on the eish, faktora, and this could be done at night. And yet, there's no question in anyone's mind, but Zera can't deny it, that if a zar would do the hekter, the evarim updarim, he would certainly be chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. And if we go back to Daf Chav Daled, we'll see there that in the list of avodos which generate a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim if they are implemented by a zar, one of them is going to be a varim u'pedarim. It's obvious that this is an avoda, even though balayla, and yet it requires kahuna. And not only that, it's a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim in an event that the zar does this avoda. How then can we maintain Rabbi Zera's premise that any avoda that's kshera balayla can be performed by a zar, or at least, even if we cannot allow the zar to do it, if the zar b'diavad went ahead and he did the avoda, then he's not chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. Here's a case of a varim p'torim. It's an avodas laila at the face of it, and yet the zar is chayiv misa. The Gemara answers, wait a minute, you misunderstood the essential categorization and the fundamental nature of a varim u'pdarim. Sof avodas the Yoma. Gemara points out that in truth, the carbon that was brought yesterday morning or yesterday afternoon, it's a varim and pdarim should be burnt yesterday during the day. It's only an event that there wasn't enough time during the course of the day to achieve this haktara. We're allowed to spill it into the night. But fundamentally, it certainly is an avodas yom. And that's how we're going to define it. That's not true for Seder Hamarocha. Seder Marocha is not related to yesterday's avodah. It is in anticipation, preparation for tomorrow's avodah. And yet, it's an avodah that's done, implemented by Laila. And once again, the Gemara is going to take Rabbi Zera's premise to task. Arei Trumas Hadeshen. What about Trumas Hadeshen? That's performed before morning, before daybreak, and yet the halacha is that it requires a Kohen. And we cannot accept the Trumas Hadeshen of a non-Kohen. Why do you, Rabbi Zera, maintain that any avoda that is an avodas laila is not exclusively in the realm, in the domain of the Kohen. What about Trumas Hadeshin? It seems to be clearly related to Lila, and yet it requires, in an absolute way, requires a Kohen. In fact, if you open up to Vayikra Perik Vav, you'll see explicitly that the Torah requires that this section of the ash that has to be removed and put on the side of the Mizbech has to be implemented by the Kohen. And if a Kohen is required for this avodah of Trumas Hadeshin, that undermines the premise of Rabbi Zera that an avodas Laila can be implemented by a Yisrael. Now, again, according to most Rishonim, as we mentioned earlier, Tos Yishonim and others, the Gemara is basically assuming in its kasha, in its slug up here, Varei Trumas Hadeshin against Rabbi Zera, that if a non-Kohen, a Zara, would bring the Trumas, would be mafresh, the Trumas Hadeshin, he'd be chayav mitzvah b'dei shamayim. And the Gemara answers, Tchilas avoda di Yoma, that even though the Trumas Hadeshin is actually implemented before daybreak, but nevertheless it's classified in a conceptual way as avodas yom. It is the beginning of the avodah of the yom, not the way Rabbi Zera and the Makshin thought that since it could be done before daybreak, it's an avodas laila, and it really belongs to yesterday because we're getting rid of the ashes of yesterday's zeva. No, says the Gemara, I'm going to prove to you that Trumas Hadeshin really belongs to the day. It's an avodah d'yimama. Hence, it requires kahuna, and a non-Kohen would be chayav mitzvah b'dei shamayim if he does the Trumas Hadeshin. The Omer Rabbi Yasi, Omer Rabbi Yochanan, kidesh yadav l'trumas hadeshin, and we have a halacha that kiddush yadayim raglayim from one day to the next just doesn't do it. It's got to be the kiddush yadayim on this day for all the avodah subsequent on that day. But yet, Rabbi Yochanan tells us that if an event that the Kohen did the kiddush yadayim raglayim before the Trumas Hadeshin, then Eino tzarich lekadesh, he doesn't need another kiddush yadayim raglayim for the avodah tomorrow. It means that Trumas Hadeshin is really the kickoff. It's the beginning of the avodas yom. Otherwise, if it wasn't avodah of yom, then clearly the kiddush yadayim raglayim of yesterday, of the night, would not be valid and operative for the avodah of the yom. Shevkar kidesh mitchilas ha'avodah. Rabbi Yochanan says that he began the avodah with Trumas Hadeshin. He did the kiddush yadayim raglayim before that avodah of Trumas Hadeshin, and that carries him over for the entire day. So we see that even though Trumas Hadeshin is actually implemented before daybreak, nevertheless it's really halachically, conceptually categorized and classified as an avodas yom. And here we have a problem that's raised by the Rishonim because there's something very strange over here. Let's compare this avodah of Trumas Hadeshin to the avodah of Siddur HaMarocha, putting the wood on the fire. Now, the halacha of Siddur Marocha, that avodah has to take place after the Trumas Hadeshin. If now the Gemara is classifying Trumas Hadeshin as an avodas yom, then Kol Shkein, the Siddur Marocha that comes subsequent to the Trumas Hadeshin must be also, has to be an avodas yom. And yet, we saw that Rabbi Zera rejects Rabbi Yochanan with regard to a Zar who was Mesader the Marocha, because Rabbi Zera is of the opinion that Siddur Marocha is an avodas Laila. How can it be an avodas Laila when Trumas Hadeshin is defined as an avodas Yom? And Rabbi Zera has no choice but to accept the definition and the classification of Trumas Hadeshin as an avodas Yom. Otherwise, why would a Zar be chayav for Trumas Hadeshen when Reb Zera's premise is that an Avodas Laila cannot generate a Chiyuv Misa B'dei Shamayim? Now, once Reb Zera his back is up against the wall, and he has no choice but to assume and classify Trumas Hadeshen as Avodas Yom, how much more so Seder Maracha should be an Avodas Yom? And yet it was Reb Zera himself who contended against Rabbi Yochanan and insisted that a Zar would not be chayav misa for Seder Maracha because it's an Avodas Laila. And it's interesting that the Ritva is so pressed by this kasha that he answers that sometimes the Seder Maracha of the Eitzim was in the Laila, not as an introduction to today, but rather as a conclusion to yesterday. And he says that in certain occasions, that Seder HaEitzim was made in the middle of the night, perhaps. He just says during the course of the night. And it is for yesterday's service, the previous day's service. Let's say, for example, the Eish wasn't strong enough to burn the Eivarim P'darim, so they had to be Masada, the Eitzim on the Mizbech in order to burn the Eivarim P'darim, but that belongs to yesterday's carbon, as we said before. And therefore, we cannot classify Seder Eitzim as an absolute Tchilas Yomama, Tchilas Avodah Yomama. Trumas Hadeshen, on the other hand, is purely for the purpose of preparing for the morning for the next day's Avodah. Now, we had back on Daf Chav Beis a presentation, or shall we say, a version of Rabbi Yochanan that Trumas Hadeshen is not really an Avodas Yom at all. And if we accept that transmission of Rabbi Yochanan, then Reb Zera here is not correct. Reb Zera here is assuming that in the case of Trumas Hadeshen, we absolutely require a Kohen because it is the Avodas Yom. And according to that girsa, that nisuach of Rabbi Yochanan, back on Daf Chav Beis, that Rabbi Yochanan is not saying that Trumas Hadeshen is an Avodas Yom. I mean, if you accept that, then Reb Zera here cannot be accepted, because Reb Zera here is assuming that Trumas Hadeshen is an Avodas Laila. And I mean to say that the Trumas Hadeshen in the way Reb Zera understood Rabbi Yochanan, certainly Trumas Hadeshen was an Avodas Laila. And that's why Rabbi Zera refuted Rabbi Yochanan, attacked Rabbi Yochanan, because how could you say, therefore, the Zar is chayav misa for an Avodas Laila? And Rabbi Zera himself holds that Trumas Hadeshen is an Avodas Yom. But according to that girsa, that even Rabbi Yochanan himself holds that the Trumas Hadeshen is right. According to that girsa, once again, that Rabbi Yochanan does not maintain that Trumas Hadeshen is an Avodas Yom. So then Rabbi Zera must be assuming that if Rabbi Yochanan classifies Trumas Hadeshen as Avodas Laila, how could it be that the Zar would be Chayav Misa? Now, Rabbi Zera, when he challenges Rabbi Yochanan, he's assuming that in the case of Seder Eitzim al Gabi Mizbeach, which can be implemented Balaila, How could it possibly be that a zar is chayiv misa? And if we assume that Trumas Hadeshen is an avodas yom, then there's no comparison between Trumas Hadeshen and Seder Maroch al Gabi Mizbeach. It makes more sense, therefore, to assume that in Rav Zera's mind, when he was contending and objecting against Rabbi Yochanan, he meant to assume that both Seder Marocha and Trumas Hadeshen are both avodas laila. So the Gemara says, "Velo kasha." So now we come back to our original question: how could Rabbi Yochanan maintain that a zar is chayiv misa for Seder Marocha when, after all, it's an avodas laila? And again, Trumas Hadeshen, we're going to have to assume, is an avodas yom, and therefore it generates a chiyuv misa b'dei shemayim on a zar. So at this point, the Gemara goes back to Rabbi Yochanan, as we indicated before, to rewrite Rabbi Yochanan, ki itmar hachi itmar. This is what Rabbi Yochanan was saying. Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, zeh shesider shnei gizrei eitzim. If a zar sets up two gizrei eitzim, not the cedar eitzim al gamer marocha, that for sure is an avodas laila, which would not generate on the part of a zar chiyuv misa b'dei shemayim. But cedar gizrei eitzim, that's where Rabbi Yochanan says that the zar is chayiv. Ho'il avodas yomi, that is certainly an avodas yom. And the Torah says explicitly, "Ubir aleh kohen eitzim ba'boker," indicating that it's an avodas yom. Maskiv lo Rava elamiata tiboy pious. Now, Rav is going back to the discussion about pious, right? We have to divide up the avodas hakohanim by lottery, and Rav is assuming that with regard to Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, there is no pious. Now, if you're telling me that it's an avoda that has to be implemented by a kohen, and you're classifying it as an avodas yom, then it should be divvied up amongst the kohenim through this lottery. And nowhere in the Mishnah does it mention that Shnei Gizrei Eitzim requires a pious. So the Gemara says, "Ishtamitei ha desanya." Rava missed a brisa. What does the brisa say? Misha zacha b'trumas hadeshen zacha b'sidur marocha b'sidur Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. They combined and integrated three different avodos into one pious. And the reason for that is that each one of these avodos unto itself, unto herself, I guess you'd say, doesn't seem that significant in the eyes of the Kohen. So to make it attractive and gather together a number of Kohanim vying and competing through the lottery for getting this avoda, we'd have to combine all these three avodas together. So that's Trumas Hadeshen together with Seder Marocha, and finally with Seder Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. So Rava was objecting because he felt that you needed, if you classify Shnei Gizrei Eitzim as an avodas yom, and it requires Kohen, and Rabbi Yochanan says the zar is chayiv misa, then for sure it's upgraded to the status of an avoda that needs pious. But Rava didn't realize that in fact there is a pious. Not that we don't need a pious with regard to Seder Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, but we actually have a pious because it's included, incorporated into the pious for the Trumas Hadeshen and the Seder Maroch. Now the Gemara is going to ask the Meimer Davodas Yom by pious. We're now questioning Rava. Rava is predicated on the assumption that any avoda that requires Kohen and its avodas yom should be subject to a pious. So the Gemara asks, avodas laila lo boy pious v'rei evarim upidarim. We have in the list in the Mishnah on Daf Chaf Pei of those avodas that are subject that require pious, we have Eivarim U'P'tarim, meaning the Haktor of the Eivarim U'P'tarim was given to that Kohen who won the lottery. And what are you talking about? Eivarim U'P'tarim are burnt at night. Yeah, but now we have to go back to what we established before, and that is that Sof Avodah Yoma, that basically the Eivarim U'P'tarim belonged to yesterday's Zevach. And it's just a spillover, an event that they didn't get a chance. There wasn't enough time to do the Aktar of the Eivarim U'P'tarim, but it really belongs to yesterday. And if it belongs to yesterday, we understand very well that it's an Avodas Yom, and therefore it requires pious. Or as for a Trumas Hadeshen, there is a pious on Trumas Hadeshen, and yet Trumas Hadeshen can be implemented at night. And this is all based on the Mishnah back on Daf Chaf Beis. Now, again, even though we have said before that Trumas Hadeshen, in order to explain Rabbi Zera, we said that that really belongs to the Yom. And Tchilas Avodas the Yomi, we proved it from Kiddush Yadayim with Trumas Hadeshen, Ein Tzarech L'Kadesh L'Mochar. Yeah, but that's only in order to explain Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Zera, but Rava seems to assume that the criterion for pious is Yom or Laila, not the nature of the avoda, but the time period in which you actually implement it. And since Trumas Hadesh is implemented at night, hence it should not be included in the pious. And the Gemara says, no, we have to revamp Rava a little bit. Sof avoda d'Yoma. Even Rava agrees that I'm sorry. The Sof, in the case of Pedarim, that's clearly an Avodas Yom. That's Sof Avodah Yoma. But in the case of Trumas Hadeshen, since it's implemented at night before daybreak, it should not be included in the pious. More answers, Mishum Maaseh Shahoy. Right? We had the Mishnah recording the case of a Kohen who was in such a rush up the ramp, up to Kevesh, in order to get into that Dalet Amos and be Zocha first in the Trumas Hadeshen. He pushed another Kohen over the ledge, over the Kevesh, and he fell and broke his leg. So because of that, therefore they instituted a pious to avoid any serious injuries. Now again, could the Gemara have given the answer that we gave before for Rabbi Zera and for Rabbi Yochanan, that Trumas Hadeshen is Avodas Yom? It could be, but again, that depends upon the different Girsos back on Daf Chaf Beis in Rabbi Yochanan, as we said before. So the Gemara wants to work it out according to all the different Nuschos and Girsos of Rabbi Yochanan. And in the first Girsa of Rabbi Yochanan, Gemara said that it does not say that the separating the Truma of the Deshen is an Avodas Yom. So according to that Girsa, that Truma Sadeshen is not an Avodas Yom, which was the Havamina here now is Sugi Rabbi Zera, and that was the first Girsa of Rabbi Yochanan. So therefore the Gemara wants to give another explanation as to why they did a pious. They included Trumas Hadeshen in the pious, even though it's not an Avodas Yom. The Gemara says, "L'meimra d'Avodas Yom v'shezar chayv aleh misa by pious ein zar chayv aleh misa lo by pious." Is Rabbi Yochanan saying that only an avoda which is unique and exclusive to a Kohen is included in the pious? An avoda that doesn't require kahuna is not included in the pious. For a shchita is included in the pious. And that's what the Mishnah says back on Daf Chaf Hey. And yet, shchita is ksher and bizarre. So you see, you don't need to identify an avoda that requires pious as an avoda that's exclusive for Kohanim. More answers, shiny shchita to tchilas avoda he. The avodah, the carbon tamid, which culminates with zrikas hadam, begins with shchita. And if that be the case, the reason why shchita is included in the ayis is because it's the beginning of an entire series, all of which form one basic unit called avodah. Now, we haven't spoken about the Mizbeach HaPnimi. There is a requirement of Trumas HaDeshen from the Mizbeach HaPnimi. And we have to assume that that begins the avodah on the Mizbeach. Now, there's also Hotzas HaDeshen. And not only that, there's also Dichun HaMenorah. And then there's the Holochas Haivarim Al Gabe HaMizbeach. Now, all of these are subject to pious. They require pious, and the answer is right here. Just like Shchita requires pious because it's Tchilas Avodah, so too, Trumas Hadesh from the Mizbeach HaPnimi is the beginning of the Avodah as far as the Mizbeach is concerned. And the Dishan HaMenorah is also the beginning of the Avodah of Adlokas HaMenorah. In the case of bringing the Eivarim up to the Mizbeach, there too, that's the beginning of the Haktorah. That's why all of the above require pious. Now, as far as Sidur Shnei Gizrei Eitzim is concerned, L'chora, we would say that that's not Tchilas HaAvodah. And really, it should not have required pious. But the reason why we required pious is because of the Chiyuv Misa B'dei Shamayim in the case of Azar. So if we wanted to find what actions on the part of the Kohen require pious or not, we would say it fit into these two categories. Either it's an avodah that has to be performed at the beginning of an avodah, and we have many examples that we mentioned earlier, or alternatively, it's an avodah which, in the case of a zar, would be l'chayev bisa b'dei shamayim. Omar Mar Zutra v'teimer Rav Ashi v'ha anan lo tnan hachi. We have a Mishnah later on Daf Chav Ches, and the Mishnah says, Omar lehem ha'memuna Se'u Ru'u im higia zman hashchita. That we have to send a person, a scout, to see if the sun has risen and the eastern side of the horizon is lit up, and it's time for the shchita. Now, we need Yom for Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, Baboker. And yet, we're not checking out to see if it's Boker for the sake of the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. Why is that so? And keep in mind that the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim was before the Shchita Satam. So if they're going out to see if there's daybreak, they should do so not for the Shchita, but even for a previous earlier avodah, namely for the placement of the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. And even though it says Baboker, nevertheless, we're going to assume that Baboker really means Lila, in a sense. What do I mean? Baboker, and then another Baboker means before the Boker. So it's before daybreak, and that's when they do Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. And if that be the case, then so what's Gemara's kasha now? We had a Mishnah, and the Mishnah only requires a definition, a determination of Yom for the sake of the Shechita of the Tamid, not for the sake of the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. Now, Rabbi Yochanan assumed that Shnei Gizrei Eitzim is an avodas yom. And that's how we reinterpret Rabbi Yochanan as to when the Zar is Chayiv Misa. So the Gemara answers, Hach de Leslie Takanta Tani. In other words, in truth, Rabbi Yochanan is right that Shnei Gizrei Eitzim is avodas yom, and it says baboker baboker. However, there was no need to determine with the scout up on top of the roof that it's already reached the stage of Heir Pnei Mizrach for the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, because here's where there's a fundamental difference between Shechita b'diavad and Shnei Gizrei Eitzim b'diavad. If either of those two were done at Laila, there's a fundamental difference between them. Because in the case of Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, is Islay Takata. Just simply take off the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim and put it back on after daybreak. But you can't do so in the case of Shechita. Once the carbon was shechted at night, it's possible. Now, Rabbi Yochanan was understood originally that the Zar, if he is Mesader of the Eitzim on the Marach, he's Chayiv Misa b'dei Shamayim. And Rabbi Zera rejected this based on the fact that the Seder HaMaracha could be done at night. Ika Diamri. Now the Gemara says we have a different girsa in Rabbi Zera's contention, his objection against Rabbi Yochanan. Maskif le Rabbi Zera v'chiyesh lecha avoda sheyesh achrea avoda psula b'zar. How could you, Rabbi Yochanan, exclude a zar from Seder Eitzim when Seder Eitzim is not an avoda tama? We require an avoda tama in order to be mechayev a zar who usurps that avoda to be chayev misa b'dei shamayim, and that means avoda tama en achrei avoda. But here in the case of Seder HaMaracha, certainly that is not an avoda tama, because it's only a preliminary stage to set up the Mizbeach for the Avoda and for the Torah. And here we'll turn to Daf Chavches. Gemara says, wait a minute, you're telling me that Seder Maracha Reb Zera is not an Avoda Tama for Eivarim Uptarim? We know that Eivarim Uptarim is called an Avoda Tama. And yet, we're going to need, after the burning of the Eivarim Uptarim, we're going to need Trumas Hadesha to separate the ashes. So the Gemara answers that Reb Zera holds Sofa Avoda di Yomi, that it's true that after the burning of the Eivarim Uptarim, we're going to need to take out the ashes, but the Eivarim Uptarim, in and of themselves, are part of the Avoda of the day. And as we said earlier, it's really just the completion of the avoda of the day. So Reb Zera says the fact that there are two related avodos and they are restricted to a certain period of time, that's not enough to consider it an avoda tama, concluding avoda. He's going to argue that Seder Maracha is not an avoda tama. However, burning of the Eivarim is an avoda tana because it really belongs to yesterday's avoda. It's the conclusion of yesterday's avoda. So that even though following the Eivarim P'darim, we're going to need a Trumas Hadesha, nevertheless, the burning of the Eivarim in and of itself is really the conclusion of yesterday's avoda. Now, how does the Gemara know that Trumas Hadeshin is a tag-on, a completion of the Eivarim P'tarim? So that's mafurish in the pasuk in Vayikra Perek Vav. Okay, then. So this is where we're going to conclude our discussion as far as Daf Chav Zayin. That's Shabbos. Shabbos is, and now we'll begin Daf Chav.
Uh,